Thank you everyone for coming. Because our speaker is very distinguished, so I have to start his introduction early. So as people million, I'll just begin my introduction. Hello everyone, my name is Julie G. I'm a scientific committee member of BABCP, and it's my great honor to introduce Rory O'Connor, who's a world-leading expert in suicide research and prevention. So Rory is Professor of Health Psychology at the University of Glasgow, where he leads the internationally renowned Suicidal Behavior Research Lab. So it's one of the most active and impactful research groups in this field of suicidology globally. So over the past 30 years, Rory has made profound contributions to our understanding of the psychological processes that underpin suicidal behavior and self-harm, and those that enhance its prevention. His scientific and advocacy work has really shaped policy and practice across the UK and internationally, and this is recognized through his past election as the president of both the International Association of Suicide Prevention and the International Academy of Suicide Research. So he's the only UK researcher to have held both roles. So he's the author of the acclaimed book, When It Is Darkest, Why People Die by Suicide and What We Can Do to Prevent It. And I've heard that he's now working on a second book. He's also co-editor of the International Handbook of Suicide Prevention. And he's a passionate advocate for evidence-based prevention, public engagement, and mentoring the next generation of suicidologists. So today, Rory will be talking to us about understanding suicide risk and how to help. So please, let's give a warm welcome to Professor Rory O'Connor.
Thank you, Julie, and thanks everybody for coming today. I'm keeping you between now and lunchtime. What I'm going to try and do over the next 55 minutes is talk about some of the work that we've been doing over the last 30 years, but much of our more recent work, really trying to understand suicide risk, but crucially think about what the clinical implications of the research that we've been doing, and really to see what we can do to make a difference, crucially, to save people's lives. And in the context of the talk, it really talks probably in three parts. The first part is really trying to understand why suicidal thoughts emerge in the first place. Then looking at this transition from suicidal thinking to suicidal action. And then the third bit is to look at really the sort of intervention-based work, and I'll focus in on some work we've been doing on safety planning and trying to make a difference. But before I get into the details, it's important to recognize, obviously, the whole range of funders who've supported our research, both the traditional statutory funders as well as many, many families who've been bereaved by suicide, who have then really generously supported our work. So thank you, huge thanks to them. So in terms of the scale of the challenge that we face, there's lots of different statistics we can talk about to understand the devastating impact of suicide. So this slide here behind me illustrates some of that scale. So at least 700,000 people die by suicide globally. 1 in 100 deaths globally is by suicide. Most people who die by suicide, it occurs before the age of 50. And even more challenging is that although we're sitting here in a Western high-income country, the vast majority of the global scale of suicide occurs in low and middle-income countries. 77% of all deaths happen in those settings. So it's worth bearing that in mind when we're thinking about how do we tackle this public health, this global public health phenomenon. So getting straight into the nuts and bolts of what I'm going to talk about today, a lot of the research I'll touch on is framed in the context of a model of suicide I've developed, the Integrated Motivational Volitional Model. So the IMV model is building on the work of giants, people like Mark Williams, people like Paul Gilbert, and many others. But what I tried to do, first of all, in 2011, and then I updated it with my colleague Olivia Kirtley in 2018, was trying to understand, at that stage, to bring together what we thought we understood about the factors that lead to the emergence of suicidal thoughts. But crucially also, this transition from thoughts to action. So my model, the IMV model, is really framed as an ideation to action model. Because what it recognizes is that the factors that lead to suicidal thoughts are different from the factors that lead to suicidal action. And that's so important when you're working clinically or in a public health context. So just to give you some key sort of overview of the model, and very briefly today. And the other thing worth highlighting is all of the published research that I'll touch on today is available freely on our website at suicideresearch.info. But in essence, the model is in three parts. So as you can see in the left-hand part over here, we've got the pre-motivational phase. And the pre-motivational phase really sets the context in which suicidal thoughts and behaviors emerge. It looks at trying to understand the vulnerabilities or diatheses that we all bring to our lives. It looks at the social context, and it looks at the stressful events that often precipitate suicidal thoughts and behaviors. So that's the background context, which I describe as the pre-motivational phase. But then if we look at the central portion of the model, which is the understanding the development of suicidal thoughts, or the motivational phase, the simple message is that people become suicidal not because necessarily they want to die, but they're overwhelmed by pain, and that pain they feel trapped by. And it's that sense of entrapment which is a key driver to suicidal risk. And that sense of entrapment is often triggered by defeat and humiliation. That work that Paul Gilbert has done over many years. So understanding defeat and entrapment, or defeat and humiliation, is the key drivers to entrapment. But of course, defeat and humiliation can be triggered by shame, rejection, and loss. So then the question becomes, when we're trying to understand why suicidal thoughts emerge, the question then becomes, what are the drivers to defeat? What are the drivers to humiliation? And what are the drivers to entrapment? So it's a different way of thinking about suicide risk. Yes, suicide risk usually in high-income countries occurs in the context of mental illness. Some data suggests in high-income countries, up to 80 or 90% of people have a mental health problem at the time of death. It's much lower in low middle-income settings. But even if you accept that statistic, mental illness is not the reason people kill themselves. Mental health problems are not the reason. That's part of the context in which suicide risk occurs. Most people who are treated for depression will never be suicidal and will never die by suicide. And that's why a framework like the IMV model, which emphasizes defeat and humiliation and entrapment, is crucial to understanding suicidal risk. And then the third part of the model is called the volitional phase. And the volitional phase is trying to understand this transition from suicidal thoughts to suicidal acts. And as you'll see later on in the presentation, there are 8 key factors, 8 key volitional phase factors that I posit govern that transition. And when they're present, it increases the likelihood that individuals will move from thinking about suicide to acting on their thoughts. And again, the estimates are something about 1/3 of people who think about suicide will make that transition. And some of those, sadly, will die by suicide. Okay, so that's just giving you a broad overview of the IMV model. And I'm going to touch on different parts of the model as I progress through the presentation. But much of the next 20 or 25 minutes is on the motivational phase, is trying to understand the suicidal thoughts, the emergence of suicidal thoughts. So a good place to begin then is, well, I've made a big case for the importance of entrapment. What does the evidence say? And here's just an example of a couple of studies we've led on, which show clearly, the first study on the left-hand side is a young adult sample, and what we show clearly there over a 12-month period is levels of entrapment predict future suicidal thoughts over a 12-month period. The study on the right with Mark Williams, it looks at a sample of people, high-risk group of people who've tried to kill themselves. And we've seen them in hospital within 24 hours of a suicide attempt, and we've assessed them on entrapment and defeat and hopelessness and suicidal thoughts. And we tracked them over the next 4 years. And what this study showed was the 2 strongest predictors of whether you attempted suicide again or died by suicide was how trapped you were when we saw you in hospital. And some of them sadly died by suicide. So clear evidence of the importance of entrapment. Or using a slightly different methodology, this is a recent study led by my colleague Nikki Van Eyck, who was an intern with us. And don't worry about the details here. It's just a latent class analysis, a young adult sample from Scotland, tracking suicidal behaviour over a 3-year period. And all I want you to highlight is this green line. These represents people who high levels of defeat, high levels of entrapment in each of the 3 years of the follow-up. That group of people were much more likely to attempt suicide. So clear evidence from the quantitative data, and I'll return to some qualitative data later in the presentation, but highlighting the importance of defeat and entrapment, both in clinical and in non-clinical populations. And the evidence is as robust for young people as it is for older individuals. And indeed, there was Susan Rasmussen and Ken Souza published a systematic review last year, summarizing all of the studies they could find which tested the key pathways within my model. And they identified 100 studies, and the evidence is clear. Clear evidence for the central pathway of the model, that defeat leading to entrapment, leading to suicidal thoughts. Clear evidence for the volitional phase, as I'll return to later. So again, if you want to learn more about the sort of growing body of evidence, there's a systematic review there. And then we've also, Lizzie Winstone and Becky Mars and us, and a whole group of us, published a systematic review more recently, which is summarizing the ecological momentary assessment data linking or supporting the core components of the IMV model. So the evidence is growing, but of course there are unanswered questions, and we're continually trying to tackle those unanswered questions. Okay, so that's evidence, the empirical evidence, which is there, is clear for the importance of defeat and entrapment. Looking at specific populations, we've also been looking at neurodiversity more recently. And here's just a study led by Sarah Cassidy at Nottingham, who's doing amazing work looking at autism and suicide risk. And this is a good example of how the IMV model can be modified for specific populations. So it was really clear here in this study, individuals who scored highly on autistic traits and also engaged in camouflaging behaviors, so trying to fit in the exhaustion of camouflaging if you're autistic or experiencing autistic traits. So what you find here is high autistic traits more likely to engage in camouflaging, then more likely to report higher levels of defeat and entrapment, and subsequently suicidality. Up until a few years ago, we didn't recognize the increased risk of suicide in people who are autistic. And another psychological autopsy study that Sarah led on, also we've shown with clear evidence of that increased risk, about 10-fold increased risk relative to what you would expect in a population in terms of individuals who die by suicide, who have autistic traits. So it's a really important group that we look at. And then also we've been looking at people who are with ADHD, and we've just completed 2 studies. This is just one slide from 2 studies that we looked at funded by ADHD UK. And all I want you to take from this message is a sample of people who score above a screener in ADHD. Again, clear pathway of defeat to entrapment to suicidal thinking. And again, when we did a qualitative study as part of that work, and some of the narratives that people with ADHD are reporting of how they do feel defeated and humiliated from experiences often many years ago, including in school, and being told that they're wrong and sit at peace and you're a failure, what are you doing? You should be doing better. So again, really highlights, we've known for many years actually, that ADHD is associated with suicide risk. But we haven't looked beyond the diagnostic category. And what we're trying to do with others is trying to get underneath the category to understand, can we use the IMV model as a framework to better understand suicide risk in individuals with ADHD, and hopefully then to inform intervention development. So just a couple of examples of specific populations in which we've been trying to make some progress. The IMV model also forms now the basis for Scotland's National Suicide Prevention Strategy, a 10-year strategy. So again, we're trying to do something different in Scotland when we're thinking about preventing suicide. And the questions we're asking now, when we're thinking about policy and practice over the next 8 subsequent years, is a new policy, to what extent is it suicide protective? To what extent does that policy increase or decrease entrapment? To what extent does a policy or an initiative make people feel more humiliated and shamed rather than the opposite. So it's a different lens in which we're trying to do suicide prevention in Scotland. So that's an example of a policy initiative looking at the IMV model. This one did surprise me. These talks can be quite heavy, so a wee bit of levity, right? I got the shock of my life recently when, if anybody's seen the BBC program Blue Lights, right? It's a police drama. Has anybody seen this police drama? The IMV model. So when people talk about research impact, that's what they're talking about. Anyways, that's just a wee aside. Okay, so getting back to the serious business. How do we go about assessing entrapment? Again, building on the work of Paul Gilbert. So we've modified his original 16-item version. So there's a 16-item version of the entrapment scale. And with my colleague Derek de Boer and others in the Netherlands, we've developed a brief 4-item version. And here's how we assess it. These 4 questions, questions 1 and 2, are assessing external entrapment. So being trapped by life circumstances. Questions 3 and 4 are assessing internal entrapment, being trapped by what's going on inside your head. And in the work we've done now with tens of thousands of people, internal entrapment is always more pernicious in the context of suicide risk than external entrapment. Now, of course, they're interrelated. But when you do an analysis comparing the two, internal entrapment is always much more dangerous. So my message is what we should be doing, and I think the next slide says this, we should be targeting defeating humiliation and entrapment in treatment, and we should be monitoring and tracking levels of entrapment. Like suicidal thoughts, which we know wax and wane, come and go in periods of high intensity and then they relent. It's the same with levels of entrapment. And we should be monitoring those levels of entrapment. And even if you don't want to ask all 4 questions, just even monitor asking somebody how trapped they feel will be a good baseline in which we can track things. Okay, so that's given us some of the clinical implications. I want to now ask a slightly different question. So defeat and entrapment are important. Well, what are the mechanisms? How do we think, what increases the likelihood that people feel defeated and entrapped? And here are just some examples, right? There's lots of possibilities. But I'm just going to go through some of the work that we've been doing, looking at 5 possible mechanisms. Perfectionism, childhood trauma, identity, stigma, and then barriers to help seeking, in particular in men. Okay, let's take these each in turn. So over many, many years, we've been doing work on perfectionism. This is building on the amazing work that Paul Hewitt and Gordon Flett have been leading on in Canada. And what they talk about is there's different types of perfectionism. And the way they assess perfectionism, they talk about socially prescribed perfectionism or social perfectionism as a key, really dangerous dimension of perfectionism. And what it's defined as, it really taps the expectations and beliefs, not about standards that we set ourselves, but rather the expectations we think others have of us. And if we fail to meet those expectations, of course we internalize that. And that internalization of self-criticism, we start this cycle of rumination. And again, we've done work on this, thousands of people with adolescents right through to older adults. People in disadvantaged areas, in affluent areas. And in every single study, high levels of social perfectionism is a vulnerability factor for suicidal thoughts, suicidal behavior, self-harm more broadly. And I'm going to show on a second slide in which we've looked at this in terms of as a factor which predisposes people to feel defeated and predisposes people to feel entrapped. And the reason social perfectionism, I think, is so dangerous is it's like a metacognition. It's outside our control. It's a thought about a thought. And actually, the expectations that we think others have of us are not grounded oftentimes in reality. It's what we think people think, and that's why can be so intractable. So that's making the case for social perfectionism. I'm going to show you a slide in a couple of slides' time that illustrates it as a vulnerability factor for defeat and entrapment. The evidence for childhood trauma and suicide risk is overwhelming. This is just one study I have an identical twin brother, some people know, and he's a stress researcher, and we do work together. Let's work with Darrell. And this is one of our studies in which we looked at people with different suicidal histories. People who've attempted suicide, people who've just thought about suicide, and then a control population. And all I want you to take from this slide is, in our sample of people who've attempted suicide, 80% of them are reporting moderate levels, at least, of childhood trauma. There's lots of work out there looking at the role of childhood trauma and adversity, both in terms of, you'll see shortly, and its impact on the psychophysiology, but also impacts on our attachment relationships. And work we've done over the years with Tiago Sortia, I think he's in the audience somewhere, looking at attachment and suicide risk. And the reports there, again, of the relationship between trauma and obviously and problems with attachment. Okay, so that's made a case separately for perfectionism and trauma. And the reason for highlighting those is because what we're going to show in a second is clear evidence that not only do they have a direct effect of increase in suicide risk, they have an indirect effect through defeat and entrapment. And this is work, again, with my twin brother. I'm just summarizing 3 studies. But what 2 of these studies are daily diary studies. Because, again, we know that suicidal thoughts wax and wane, they come and go. We need to look at the moment-to-moment, day-to-day fluctuations in suicidality. And across these studies, what we found clearly is childhood trauma and perfectionism, of course, predict entrapment, and they also predict suicidal thoughts. But what we've also shown in this, for the first time, is it also has these both have an indirect effect on daily reports of defeat and daily reports of entrapment, particularly, though, that the daily reports of defeat is immediate and is a mechanism which is linking your childhood trauma and your social perfectionism to your daily reports of entrapment. So again, we can't change people's past, their childhood trauma, and it's difficult to change perfectionism, but we could target defeat, and we could target entrapment to try and mitigate the adverse impacts of these long-standing risk factors. Okay, so that's social perfectionism, and that's childhood trauma. I want to move on to identities. And there's different ways in which we can conceptualize identities as a factor which, again, conveys vulnerability for defeat and entrapment. I'm just going to give you one quote from a study led by my colleague Hazel Marsetti. And Hazel recruited a group of young people with a suicidal distress history. And she did in-depth interviews with them. And again, this quote from Lily is really powerful, but it's a different way to think about entrapment. I talked about entrapment through Paul Gilbert's scale. But what Hazel talks about is, I've just pointed at this screen. Do you see that? And wondered why you couldn't see it. Right? So this idea of queer entrapment, and it's how her identity, it's not the identity is the problem, but and you see this in the quote, her parents' appraisal or thoughts about her identity is the risk factor. And what she talks about is queer entrapment. There have been times when I've just been like, oh, if I just ended my life, it would just stop everything. No one would have to deal with it. No one would have to be like, oh, we've got a gay daughter. No one would have to deal with it. It would just stop all the problems. I felt like that was the only way out of it all, was just to disappear. What a powerful description of entrapment. And remember, the problem here is not Lily's identity. The problem is society's prejudice and discrimination. And that's just one example of one identity. Look at other identities which minoritized or racialized, and we can start to see how those identities convey an increased risk of defeat and humiliation and entrapment. And that's why, as you'll see later on, we need to take a public health approach to tackle that prejudice, that discrimination, wherever it is found. Okay, so that's identity. We've done social perfectionism, we've done trauma. I want to move on to stigma. Led by my colleague, Jessica Wiley, we've recently published a scoping review of 100 studies looking at suicide-related stigma. And again, all I want you to take from this slide is there's abundant evidence that suicide-related stigma impacts on help seeking. It impacts in grief difficulties if you're bereaved by suicide. It impacts on your mental health and also is associated with increased risk of suicide. And there's lots of mechanisms by which it's increasing risk. Some of them are illustrated here: shame, guilt, fear, secrecy. And also making you more likely to feel defeated and trapped by your suicidal thoughts, ashamed of your suicidal thoughts. And Jessica also has just recently had a paper accepted in which she's done detailed interviews, again with people who've attempted suicide or thought about suicide. And these two quotes are, again, really powerful. I felt like this, like pariah in the corner in the ward. No one speak to that girl because she's the one that attempted suicide. She's just taking up a bed. That's a young person saying that today. So when people say that these sorts of attitudes are in the past or these sorts of experiences are in the past, they're not. I know for a fact when I've spoken to my parents about it, oh God, you know, the subject's changed pretty quickly. So again, even another example of the influence of parental attitudes. But just two examples, there's many, many you can read in the paper, of the pervasive impact of stigma. You pointing at me? Oh, all right. I thought I couldn't work out what was going on there. Or waving, wasn't pointing, it was waving. I thought I was doing something odd. Okay. The last part of this section of talk is looking at barriers to help seeking. This is work led by my colleague Susie Bennett. And this is what we did in this study was we've done detailed thematic analysis of responses in a survey, a worldwide survey of I think it was 725 or 750 people. And what we were interested here was looking at what do men tell us are the barriers to their help seeking. And we used as a framework to look at our analysis, Susan Mickey's COM-B framework, which says if you're trying to look at behavior or behavior change, you're looking at what people's motivation to engage in the behavior. Second one, what are their opportunities to engage in that behavior? And thirdly, what's their capability or capacity? And when you do the thematic analysis, what the men are telling us, because we know that men obviously statistically are less likely to present to clinical services or seek help for suicidal crises. But again, you have clear evidence here of motivational barriers, negative experiences like accessing help, the feeling that if they access help, it undermines their autonomy or sense of agency. There's lots of possible different ways in which you can conceptualize motivation. Opportunity, often it's costly, both in financial as well as in other resource ways. There's also inaccessibility of services. And also, are the services tailored to their needs? And indeed, most of the evidence suggests that they're not. And then we look at capabilities as an example here. Actually, a lot of men told us they don't actually have the language oftentimes to talk or make sense of their feelings. But other times, they don't trust. There's a poverty of trust. They don't trust the health sector or settings because their experiences have been so negative and bad. And indeed, again, some examples of this from the words of the men themselves. So we've got finances, personal shame up here. Whole idea then about, I know how bad the waiting lists are. The opportunity costs here, they're just not there. And I can't afford that. Therapy doesn't undo abuse. The barriers are that it doesn't work. I've tried this nonsense and it's a waste of time. Once again, I do not deserve my problems. So internal self-worth issues. I don't know how to put my issues into words. Again, this idea of poverty of language. So again, when we're thinking about trying to understand and prevent suicide, we need to speak to more men. So one of the most alarming statistics in the suicide prevention field is, in high-income countries, 3/4 of all suicides are by men. Most of the research is not on men. We published a systematic review of the quantitative literature a few years ago, and we could find, I think it was 105 prospective studies led by Cara Richardson. And then we recently, again, this is Susie Bennett's work with Thiago and others. We synthesized what we could find over the last 20 years was all the evidence, qualitative research, looking at male suicide, either people bereaved by male suicide or men who were suicidal or had attempted suicide. And what's really incredible here is that, first of all, there's only 78 studies that we could identify over the last 20 years. But what we tried to do was try to use the words of the men to make sense of why they're telling us they're suicidal. And what Susie developed then was what she calls the 3D model of masculine norms and male suicide risk. And in essence, the 3Ds are trying to understand the dysregulated psychological pain that men experience. And the 3Ds are in terms of denial, disconnection, and dysregulation. And again, there's lots of examples of how those 3Ds then impact on your emotions, impact on your sense of self, and impact on your interpersonal connections. And again, I urge anybody who's working with men who are suicidal, please read the words of the men themselves. And we need to tailor services for men because the services out there are not fit for purpose. And if you look at the evidence base for what works to prevent suicidal behavior, if you look at the NICE guidelines, we know that they work. Psychological treatments work to prevent suicidal thoughts and behaviors. We have no idea whether they work for men. No idea whether they work for men because the studies have not been conducted. It's been a neglected population. And of course, that's only one group of people who've been neglected. There are many others who are neglected. Now, not only have we looked at risk in this context, we've also looked at recovery. We talk about the 3 R's model of recovery. It's the same idea. This time we're looking at recognition, reconnection, and regulation. Again, as that relates to your emotions, your sense of self, and interpersonal connections. Okay, so that's just a bee in my bonnet. I just want to highlight there the lack of research in this context. What I want to move on to now is go back a bit to the motivational phase and think about how this might be clinically relevant. So again, over years, we've been looking at different aspects in which people project themselves mentally into the future and trying to understand suicide risk. And we've done that in 2 different ways. We've looked at people's future thinking. Again, building on the work of Andrew McLeod, Andrew showed in the 1990s that the absence of positive future thinking, rather than the representation of negative future thoughts, that's much more dangerous for suicide risk. It's the absence of the positive. And then we've also done some work in which we've looked at people's desire to live, or their wish to live, or will to live, versus their wish to die. And we'll just say in a second that although we've made some progress in understanding both of those concepts, there are some gaps I'm going to highlight in a second. So although we've shown, and we've also shown, and Andrew's work has shown, that the lack of positive future thinking is crucial to understanding suicide risk, most of the research has been correlational. There's been very few experimental studies in which you try to see, can you manipulate or can you induce changes in positive future thinking? Or crucially, to what extent is positive future thinking affected by mood? So I'm going to show you a study in which we looked at that. And then in the desire to live versus desire to die, in this bottom study with Christine Cha and Matt Nock, what we showed there was in an implicit attitudes test that actually people's implicit attitudes to live versus die, when you try and predict future suicidal thoughts, it's their implicit wish to live. The weakness of that is the key predictor. It's not their wish to die. That's not the most crucial bit. And indeed, that goes back to my message that when we think about suicide risk, it's so often not about wanting to die, but wanting unbearable pain to end. So what I'm going to talk about are 2 studies related both to positive future thinking and then this aspect of wish to live versus wish to die, which we can characterize as ambivalence. So as I say, we've got correlational evidence that positive future thinking is bad for you, but we don't know how sensitive it is to change of mood. And then we don't really understand in a day-to-day way how those wish to live versus wish to die fluctuates. Because we know they fluctuate moment by moment, hour by hour. And I'm going to show you findings from an intensive ecological momentary assessment study with inpatients, psychiatric inpatients, in which we look at wish to live and wish to die. So the first thing then is the future thinking. Right, the first future thinking, it's a very simple design. We recruit people into the lab who've either had suicidal history or don't have a suicidal history. And we then, using the standard future thinking task, we assess your positive future thoughts, things you're looking forward to in the next week, the next year, the next 5 to 10 years at baseline. We then do a negative mood induction, and then we reassess your positive future thoughts. And a simple question we're asking is, do your positive future thoughts change following a negative mood induction? And crucially, is that change or reduction more marked in people who are suicidal? So that's the first thing you'll see in a second. And in the second study I'm going to show you is looking at this suicidal ambivalence. We're going to look at these conflicting emotions, these motivational orientations of wish to live versus wish to die, and ask which of these is most important in understanding fluctuations in suicidal thinking, or what's sometimes called suicidal desire. So here's the findings from the first study. So this is the experimental study I just described. So these are the pre-mood induction, post-mood induction, and positive future thoughts. So in those who have no suicidal history, there's a modest but not significant decrease in their positive future thoughts post the negative mood induction. But you see a stark decrease in the people with a suicidal history. So clear evidence in this study that people with a suicidal history, first of all, we know they overall generate fewer positive future thoughts, so that fewer reasons for living, arguably, and they show a much greater decline in positive future thoughts. And the clinical implications are also clear, that positive future thinking is sensitive to mood changes. We should be thinking about monitoring positive future thoughts in a clinical context, and then thinking about how we can enhance positive future thinking. Okay, so that's a very clear message from the positive future thinking literature. Going back now to the ambivalence idea. So again, as I said, we do this intensive study with, in this case, 50 inpatients. And you can see here, we've got 10 prompts a day to look at their wish to live, their wish to die, and their suicidal desire over a 10-year period. And not only are we trying to look at predicting suicidal desire over time, we're trying to then compare people who've attempted suicide previously compared to those who've never attempted suicide to see, is there a distinct pattern of wish to live versus wish to die, in particular in those who've attempted suicide? And the answer, as you'll see in a second, is yes. So here's just the first slide on this. So these are people who attempted suicide. So unsurprisingly, their wish to live is much weaker than those with no history, and their wish to die is much higher. Okay? But then if you combine your wish to live and wish to die into one score, like an index of ambivalence, what you find is very stark as well. Isn't that beautiful? I didn't do it. Mareike Ernst, this is work led by Mareike Ernst, who's now in Austria. But what's very clear here, the more orange your color, the more evidence of ambivalence. And what's really clear, those who've attempted suicide are much more ambivalent. Much more ambivalent between wanting to live and wanting to die. So what are the key messages thus far from this study? Key messages are people with suicide attempt history, right? They're higher wish to die and higher suicidal desire. They have this lower wish to live, and there's much more variability and much more ambivalence. And then what we did in this study was to see, can we predict moment by moment, hour by hour, changes in suicidal desire from your wish to live and wish to die? And the answer is yes. And again, there's a fancy graph which shows it. But what this shows, I'll highlight the key messages because it's difficult to discern, is what we find in this one is, when you're trying to predict moment-to-moment suicidal desire, wish to live is important. The interaction between the two is important, but wish to die isn't important on its own. Really important looking at these moment-to-moment fluctuations. So, key take-home message here is wish to live and wish to die are distinct constructs, and that wish to live is a much more important predictor. So what are our clinical implications of this part of the study? It's really important that we assess these constructs separately. And wish to live deserves much more attention in a clinical context. And again, what can we do about enhancing your wish to live? And then thinking about this interaction as well. People are often have a weak wish to live and a strong wish to die, and that interaction still predicts suicidal desire over and above your wish to live. So important to look at the interaction, but more attention to the wish to live. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say about ambivalence and wish to live and wish to die. What I want to move on to now is that third part of my model, the volitional phase, and this transition from suicidal thoughts to suicidal acts. And as Julie mentioned, during COVID, I wrote a book, When It's Darkest, which summarized the last 25 years of my life working in suicide research. And I talk about my own bereavement by suicide and the countless stories of people I've met on my journey. And this is a heartbreaking quote from a mother who lost her son to suicide. I never thought he'd do it. A few weeks before his death, he had told me that he had thoughts about being dead. But I was too scared to ask him directly whether he would kill himself. I haven't stopped asking myself why I didn't ask him. Not a day passes when I don't torment myself with this question. When I look back on it now, I just didn't think he was the type of person who would kill himself. I know how ridiculous that sounds, because he was always so full of life. Utterly heartbreaking. And as somebody who's been bereaved by suicide, we all, and anyone in the audience who's been bereaved, we all can empathize, and that resonates with us, the guilt you feel of what you could or should have done. It's really important to note that although we've made progress in preventing suicide, our ability to prevent an individual suicide is really, really difficult. And we can never be held responsible for the actions of somebody else. But that quote, in many ways, sort of drove me when I was thinking about developing the IMV model and understanding this transition from suicidal thoughts to suicidal action. And so that brings me then to this third bit of my model, the volitional phase. And all I've done here is blown up that third part of my model. And what this argues simply, the volitional phase argues that if you're having suicidal thoughts, the presence of these 8 factors increases the likelihood that you'll act on your thoughts. And there's lots of evidence when you compare people who've thought about suicide with those who attempt suicide. There's clear evidence that the people who have attempted suicide have many, many more of these. They're more impulsive. They've got ready access to the means of suicide. They've mental imagery about dying or being dead, or they're impulsive. Or crucially, they have a previous history of suicidal behavior. And again, if you go to our website, you can get lots of evidence supporting the importance of these. So the key message here is if somebody is talking about thoughts of suicide, we need to be assessing these sorts of factors to try and mitigate risk and incorporate that into a safety plan. So key message here then, assess these volitional moderators. Monitor how they fluctuate over time is a key clinical implication. What I want to do now, before I move on to the intervention type stuff, is say something about some of our psychophysiological research. So I've touched mostly on psychology, psychological factors. So again, we've done lots of work on the stress response I've already mentioned. So this dysregulation of the stress response, with evidence experimentally and diary-based studies, again, work with Darrell, which shows that people who attempt suicide, in particular those who attempt suicide, have this flattened cortisol response. Right? They're less prepared to fight or flee. But we've just done a recent study looking at another physiological indicator called electrodermal activity. And what you can see, electrodermal activity is a physiological marker of emotional processing. Okay? And we can measure it, as you'll see in a second, using electrodes. And what we were interested in this study was actually, is there evidence of hyperreactivity? So people, when there's a stimuli, people who are more at risk of suicide or self-harm, that they're responding more, they're much more responsive to threats in the environment. And that might be indicated through electrodermal activity. And just the short answer is yes, as that's what we find, as you'll see in a second. So it's focusing again on this volitional phase of the model. Crucially, we're trying to look at, could this be a marker which distinguishes people who think about, in this case, the study we're going to talk about is self-harm rather than suicide specifically. Young people who think about self-harm and young people who actually self-harm. There's a collaboration with a load of folk across the UK and internationally, and this paper's just been accepted recently in Nature Mental Health. So here's the broad question, right? So here's how we're assessing electrodermal activity, using electrodes to the fingers, and don't worry about the details, but our 2 components of electrodermal activity are outlined here. They're different types of skin conductance. And that's really given us a sense of arousal, this emotional processing idea. And again, what we've done in this study is we've brought 3 groups of people into the lab. A control young people who've never ever self-harmed, a group of young people who've thought about self-harm, and then a third group of young people who've actually self-harmed. And what our key question here is Is there evidence of this hyperreactivity of the electrodermal system, right, this emotion processing, is on hyper alert, in particular in those young people who've actually self-harmed? So in this study, this is design, again, don't worry about all the details. In the design, people do 3 tasks. There's a tone-based task, which is a neutral task, and you're trying to see how quickly people habituate to listen to beep, 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 right? Then we do a stress task, and we're looking at the response during that. And we do an emotional pictures or images task. There's problems with non-responding, and we couldn't do any analysis on this. So I'm just going to talk about what we found here in a neutral task and a stress-based task. Simple question, is there evidence of heightened electrodermal response, in particular in the young people who self-harm? And as I said already, the answer is yes. Here's the slide, first of all, for this neutral task, it's just this tone-based task. It takes young people who self-harm longer to habituate to the tone-based task. Right? Different than these 2 groups. Then when we look at the stress response, the same pattern. Same pattern. The young people who self-harm are much more hyper-reactive. So they're on hyper-alert. So what are the clinical implications then of these findings? Well, what they show clearly is this could potentially be a biomarker helping us understand the transition from thoughts to action, even though this is just a case control study. Potential for biofeedback interventions to help young people. And crucially, could this hyperreactivity in young people help us understand why when you get older and you have a suicidal history, you have this flattened or broken cortisol response system. Because from a young age, you're on hyper alert. Okay? So that's all I'm going to say about that sort of psychophysiology. But again, it's really useful to think about that, both the stress response and the psychophysiology, when we're trying to understand suicide risk. Because it illustrates how both your psychophysiology and your psychology, together, of course, with your social context, are conveying potentially increased risk. So in the last part of the talk, I want to shift gear. And I'm going to focus in on safety planning and just a bit on the evidence for what we know works. Before COVID was led by Gustavo Taraki, we published a review of what we thought of all the evidence-based interventions which showed some promise either in tackling suicidal thoughts and behavior. And the good news is each of these, in terms of the psychosocial list, there's evidence that they work for some groups, not for all, but for some groups. So that's good news. And there has, if you look at the NICE guidance that I was fortunate to be involved in the development of, the evidence is clear that cognitive behavioral therapeutic interventions tend to have the strongest evidence base. But where there's been a lot of growth and activity is on the safety planning interventions. Safety planning will be familiar to everybody in the room, so it's just a standard brief intervention in 6 parts, okay? Again, if we look at the evidence for whether safety planning works, right, the evidence is growing, but it's not there yet. Right? So, key premise underlying a safety plan, I describe it as a volitional phase intervention. It's trying to interrupt those suicidal thoughts. This idea, if you've got suicidal thoughts and you've got a safety plan, that those thoughts will recede before you make a suicidal act, okay? Again, with colleagues across Europe, we published a meta-analysis of that stage of evidence. And the evidence shows that interventions which have a safety planning component are effective. But we don't know whether safety planning works on its own. We don't know whether safety planning plus telephone support is most optimal, because most of the research has it with a telephone support. And indeed, we did the only, to date, the only study in the UK, clinical study, which has looked at safety planning in this context. So we did this with Barbara Stanley and Greg Brown, who developed safety planning. And in our feasibility trial, clear evidence that we can embed safety planning and telephone support within an NHS context. We offered up to weekly phone calls 4 to 5 weeks following discharge from hospital. But we don't know whether it's effective in a large-scale trial. But hopefully, thanks to the amazing trial led by Toni Morrison, we might know. We might know whether safety planning delivered remotely in this study will reduce hospitalization 6 months later. Amazing trial that Toni is leading and we're involved in. Interestingly, this is an adaptive trial, and we're now down to Basically, the only intervention which is remaining for we finished recruitment, 954 people randomized. Safety planning is the only active arm remaining because in the interim analysis, there's certainly some signals suggesting it may be effective. Okay, in the last few minutes, I just want to say a bit about something we've developed recently. This is a beta version of a new tool we've developed, trying to bring together the IMV model stuff into a tool or something that clinicians can use. And so what we've developed is the IMV clinical or suicide risk formulation form. It's freely available on our website, and it's in 5 sections, okay? So if we just look at the pre-motivational phase, there's no surprises. Pre-motivational phase, we're inquiring about vulnerability factors, environmental influences, and triggering events, okay? Standard stuff. But then what's maybe a bit different is, in section C, we're asking people to rate key motivational phase factors, okay? Not to use in some sort of risk score, because we do not do risk scores, but basically as a way of maybe guiding prioritization, treatment formulation, and planning. And then in D, we've got assessing the volitional phase factors, which I've mentioned already. And then section D is just treatment planning, just looking at strengths and protective and positive factors, as well, of course, safety planning. So just direct your attention, and there are detailed notes on how we might use that tool available on our website. Okay, in the last couple of minutes, I want to just say something about this project I was involved in. Now, the Gone Too Soon project, which I was co-led a group of people from across the world, and we were trying to work out what are the key risk factors and actions we can take to tackle the premature mortality associated with mental illness and mental distress. And we identified 18 actionable solutions. I'm just going to highlight very quickly a few of these before we bring it to a close. We have to tackle stigma, discrimination, marginalization, gender violence, and so on. They are key drivers to suicide and to mortality more broadly. We need to look at better understanding, as I've tried to do today, that interplay between psychology, biology, and the rest. We need to harness digital technologies, but in an ethical way. We need to build effective interventions. Crucially, of course we do. And we need to, of course, make sure there is evidence of what works out there. Right? But basically, too often it's not available, or too often where people are not experiencing a compassionate response. And that needs to be embedded into everything. And then the other crucial bits about the access to effective treatments is continuity of care. Too often, people who are suicidal are discharged with little or no support. And we know risk is highest in that time period. And then the last couple of slides, and you can read the other 12 actions in the paper, which is freely available online, is if I was to summarize everything I've covered today, I try and summarize the work that I do into 4 C's. Compassion, complexity, connection, and care. We need more compassion, not just for people who are struggling, but for ourselves. The importance of self-compassion, working with people who are struggling to stay alive, is so difficult. We need to embrace complexity, recognizing there's no one answer or one tool for preventing suicide. We need to think of new models of care. We need to think of new models of reaching those who we have yet to reach adequately. None of this hard-to-reach baloney. We need to reach them. And then the 4th is connection. Even though I'm highlighting complexity and difficulty, small acts of kindness which promote human connection can save lives. Small acts of kindness which interrupt those suicidal thoughts, a WhatsApp message, a look, a smile, can save lives. We need to understand that we can all engender hope. When I think about engendering hope, I want to go to my last slide. And my last slide is taken from the Lancet Commission on Self-Harm, which I co-led with Helen Christensen, Paul Moran, and Nav Kapoor. And in that, we had commissioners who had from across the world, people with lived and living experience of suicide and self-harm. And in the commission, we included poetry and we included artwork. And this artwork is from one of our commissioners with lived and living experience of suicidality. And I want to end with her words. And she talks about hope. Hope is complicated. I have had extreme rumination about a hopeful future while having thoughts of death at the same time. How my mind would transform hopelessness to hope is difficult to explain. I think in moments of complete distress and hopelessness, our survival may still try to search the grounds for even a pinch of salt of hope, because deep down we know life is beautiful, even though living is hard. What an amazing quote. Illustrates the ambivalence I was talking about earlier, but it also highlights that every one of us can do something. Doesn't matter what our role is, clinician, family member, friend, researcher. We all can do something to promote hope. Suicide prevention is about hope. Providing hope in the darkest of days when you can't see light. And hopefully all of us doing what we do will help more people see light in the darkest of days. Thank you.